So let's just kick off by introducing ourselves. I am Mark Leon Goldberg. I'm the host of Global Dispatches, this very podcast, and we're doing more and more of these live streams, which I've really enjoyed doing. I mentioned in the previous episode I did, but it really I think does demonstrate a degree of urgency to the topics that we're discussing. So thank you all for joining this live stream. So why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Sure. Yeah. Hi, everyone. I'm Sina Tusi. I'm a senior fellow at the Center for International Policy, which is a think tank based in Washington, D.C., where I am currently located. And I've been working on issues related to U.S.-Iran relations and the Middle East and U.S. foreign policy for over 10 years now here in Washington at various think tanks and organizations. So happy to be on today to talk about the U.S.-Iran nuclear talks.
Before we get into the current state of play of the U.S. Iran nuclear talks and the various iterations and contours that these talks may take in the coming weeks and months, I was hoping that you could just take us back in time a little bit, 10 years ago to 2015 and the signing of the Iran nuclear deal, the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. This was a major breakthrough at the time. 3 years later, the new Trump administration, the first Trump administration, pulled the U.S. out of that deal. I'm curious to learn from you in those 3 years in which the United States was a participant in the JCPOA, what did it accomplish?
Yes, so the JCPOA, the nuclear deal reached with Iran during the Obama era, was the most landmark and intrusive nuclear inspections and transparency regime ever negotiated. So, in terms of the both the limitations it imposed on Iran's nuclear program, in terms of what they had to downgrade, the facilities they had to modify, there'd never been anything to this extent negotiated in the history of nuclear nonproliferation. And then the inspections and transparency measures were also unprecedented. That Iran agreed to stuff that no other kind of member of the NPT, the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty, had acceded to. Very intrusive inspections that gave the International Atomic Energy Agency, the UN watchdog on nuclear programs, really unprecedented access to Iran's nuclear program. And that deal, in terms of Iran's end of the bargain, held right up until actually a year after Trump left. Even 1 year after Trump left the deal, Iran continued to implement its obligations under the deal. And, as verified by the IAEA, and there's really no debate about this, that Iran was abiding by its end of the deal fully. Like it didn't violate it. It wasn't trying to build, covert facilities or violate the limits on enriched uranium or centrifuges or any of these various parameters. So the deal was working to really block off Iran's pathways, potential pathways to a nuclear weapon, until Trump left it, got us in this escalatory spiral. And now, 10 years after the fact, Iran's nuclear program is totally unrestrained and more advanced than it's ever been, much, much more advanced than it was before the nuclear deal, actually, in 2015. Iran is now enriching at higher levels, has much larger stockpiles of enriched uranium, is enriching with much more advanced centrifuges, and overall, its breakout time, which is a measurement of the amount of time it would need to kind of accumulate enough enriched uranium for at least one nuclear weapon, which the JCPOA increased this breakout time to over 1 year. Now it's estimated to be around a week, if not less. I mean, the estimate is days to a week. So Iran is much more at that threshold capacity to, if it decided to weaponize its nuclear program is in such an advanced state that it can dash to a bomb very quickly.
So back in 2018, what were the Trump administration's key objections that led it to want to abrogate this deal that, as you described, was working as intended?
Yeah, so Trump, he ran into, so actually the same year the JCPOA went into effect. I mean, the agreement was reached in July 2015. It started with Iran first moving to kind of abide, implement many of its commitments, including downgrading some of its nuclear stockpiles and everything. But by the time the deal fully went into effect and the US starting to give Iran some sanctions relief, it was early 2016.
Mm,
And, obviously the same year that Trump ran on calling it the worst deal in history, all this very hyperbolic rhetoric about how it's a terrible deal. And so, but his criticisms of the deal were never that nuanced per se, his own personal criticisms. Interestingly, to the extent that he did give like more detailed criticisms himself of the deal, exactly what was wrong with it. He said that, this deal basically allowed other countries to trade more with Iran, like Europe or China or Russia,
mm,
but the US still couldn't trade with Iran. Um, So, because the US primary sanctions regime that preceded the nuclear crisis and really goes back to after the 1979 revolution and was increased in the 1990s, that remained in place. Now, the JCPOA did allow for a provision that allowed America to sell Iran airplanes. So Boeing reached an MOU with Iran after the JCPOA, and it also allowed for subsidiaries of US companies based abroad to deal with Iran. But anyway, so that was interesting that, especially in relation to today's debate, Trump seemingly has always had this gripe that, he does view international relations in a very transactional way, in a very commercial way. And, in the current negotiations, this issue of trade and trading potentially with Iran, or even maybe putting US primary sanctions on the table or lessening some other, broader obstacles or giving licenses to US companies to deal with Iran, that might be on the table. But regardless, Trump, when he left the deal, he had built this team of really ardent interventionists and Iran hawks. Um, People like Mike Pompeo as his Secretary of State. Um, by the time he got on the maximum pressure campaign, John Bolton had becomes national security advisor, who's an ardent Iran hawk. I mean, many of his early advisors in his first term, like Rex Tillerson, um, and General McMaster, they kind of were more, they didn't want to leave the JCPOA. They warned against it. They were sidelined. Trump assembled this team of uber Iran hawks and enacted this policy of maximum pressure, which I would argue is really a policy, Trump kind of portrayed it as aimed at getting a better deal. A deal, again, it's kind of ambiguous. There are various definitions of what a better deal could be, both then and now. But at least then, what the administration said in Trump's first term was, getting Iran to give concessions on its missile program, on its regional kind of alliance network.
yeah,
But I would argue that it really was not aimed at a deal in his first term, at least to the extent that his senior advisors like Pompeo and Bolton had a control over the nuclear profile then.
yeah,
And they really wanted a regime change policy towards Iran. They really, like, Bolton at some point said something like, we're going to squeeze them till the pipes squeak.
yeah.
And,
I mean,
yeah.
like, I ask you to take us back in time, then because, here we are now, back in the Trump administration, and just the dynamics around securing a nuclear deal are profoundly different than they were back then. Like, there is no talk of, like, maximum pressure. He is not surrounded by the same kind of hawks like John Bolton, like Pompeo, that he was back then. And this seemingly led to what, by all accounts, was a somewhat productive direct talks between Steve Witkoff, Trump's like envoy to everything, and Iran's foreign minister back in April. Can you describe, like, what do we know about what was accomplished at those talks, and what the basic tone and tenor coming out of it was?
Yeah, so I mean, it's interesting because again, I mean, I think it's very important to highlight that divide that did exist in his first term between Trump. Even in Trump's first term, he did say he wanted a deal, he wanted a better deal, but it was very clear that the team he had assembled would not get him that deal. They even, according to Bolton's memoir, he said that him and Pompeo signed a resignation pact over
Yeah,
Iran diplomacy. That if Trump was going to move towards like serious diplomacy with Iran, they would resign.
yeah,
But yeah, I mean, heading to, the election last year, Trump again really emphasized that I want to get a deal with Iran. They just can't have a nuclear weapon. I would have got a deal very quickly if, the 2020 election wasn't rigged, as you would always say.
Yeah.
So then, as you say, so this time, I think it has been surprising to a large extent the speed at which he has pursued these kind of more serious talks with Iran. He did impose a presidential memorandum, not an executive order, in February, reimposing maximum pressure on Iran, which was never really lifted by the Biden administration. Biden also, I mean, we can get into that later if you want, but he tried to just re-enter the 2015 deal, and he couldn't do that. But Trump, has held this kind of, he's pursued these negotiations now with Steve Witkoff leaving them, with a kind of trying to seem very, very tough, right? So he's always threatening Iran. He's always saying that the choice is either between a deal or bombing them, between kind of dismantling its nuclear facilities nicely or viciously, as I believe he said recently. So, we've had 5 rounds of negotiations now. The US has given a written proposal to Iran about 2 weeks ago now, which this written proposal was like basically bullet points. But it seems like they're trying to agree on general principles at this stage of what an end state would look like. And then they're going to kind of, and the idea would be they would announce this as kind of an agreement on a framework for a deal. And that might entail initial reciprocal concessions. For example, Iran might see 60% enriched uranium. America might lift some restrictions on Iranian frozen assets in Qatar or elsewhere. I mean, I don't know. These are just, speculations that are the kind of,
Mhm.
based off what each side wants. But, the main sticking point, which is a major point of division between them, is over Iran enriching uranium, which
Mhm.
Iran, has invested obviously decades of resources and its domestic capabilities and paid a huge cost for building a nuclear program and building a kind of really mastering the nuclear enrichment cycle and the whole cycle from mining the uranium to converting it to uranium gas, enriching that, and with the idea being that, the Iranians say that they want ultimately to have a peaceful nuclear energy program, a civil program, and they want to be able to have the ability to provide for the fuel of it themselves and therefore need enrichment. And
And it's
also,
worth yeah,
yeah,
it's worth just noting that, the original Iran nuclear deal, the JCPOA, did permit low levels of Iranian, enrichment in, exchange for on the condition of that there were, intrusive inspections to make sure that they did not enrich above certain levels. So this
yeah,
is kinda what the deal looked like before.
yeah, yeah. But so, I mean, you know, if you, so with the enrichment, to enrich enough to have a level of enrichment that's necessary for a nuclear weapon, it's or weapons grade enriched uranium is 90% generally is the minimum, where you want to hit. And so Iran, under the original Obama era deal, limited its enrichment to 3.67%, which is a level of enrichment which is exclusively only, able to be used for peaceful purposes and producing nuclear fuel for like nuclear power plants and reactors and whatnot. So Trump, so in terms of if the goal is to prevent Iran from having pathways to a nuclear weapon, being able to weaponize its nuclear program in a fast way to, really prevent it from having this kind of threshold nuclear weapons capacity, I would argue, and many non-proliferation experts and arms control experts maintain that it's not necessary for to have this zero enrichment demand. That this is an unrealistic, untenable demand, and ultimately the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which Iran is signatory to, it allows for the full fuel cycle. It mentions, the full fuel, the nuclear cycle. So, but the way Iran and most other countries actually interpret that is that it allows for the right to enrich uranium.
Hmm.
And there are many other countries, several other countries that are not nuclear weapon states that do have uranium enrichment, including in Europe, Brazil, Japan. Um, so, if Trump is going to push this zero enrichment, I mean, I think there's still, it's the JCPOA is at this stage, outdated. Just given the extent of Iran's nuclear advances, the nuclear knowledge it's gained, the extent of the sanctions regime against Iran, whatever new deal takes form, if it takes form, is going to be different than the JCPOA. And I think this idea that's been promoted and was reportedly in the U.S. proposal a couple weeks ago was for regional and consortium on
Yeah.
enrichment.
Can you explain that a little bit? Because it seems to me, based on what I've read, the key sticking point is that the Trump administration is insisting on zero enrichment on Iranian soil. The Iranians, for all the reasons you described, that's a non-starter. They want to be able to enrich some uranium in order to, pursue, as they say, their peaceful nuclear programs. But in this mix is this idea that's being floated to somehow provide Iran with enriched uranium, but not domestically, not created or enriched on uranium soil, but rather use a consortium of regional actors working in partnership to provide Iran the enriched uranium it might need for its civilian nuclear program.
Yeah, so I actually think it's a good idea. Like it's a workable idea, and it is something that exists in other parts of the world, including in Latin America and in Europe with things like Urenco, where there are these joint consortiums where, uranium enrichment is, as we've been talking about, a dual use technology that it is used for very legitimate, peaceful purposes that many countries use it for, both for nuclear energy and producing kind of various medicines. So, we see right now in the Persian Gulf region that not only has Iran built up its own indigenous nuclear program and nuclear fuel cycle, but countries like Saudi Arabia and the UAE have expressed an interest in nuclear energy as well. And they're building reactors. So the UAE has signed an agreement with the United States. It's called the 123 agreement to basically get nuclear uh, support and technology and assistance for nuclear power from the United States, but agree not to have its own kind of domestic enrichment and nuclear fuel cycle capabilities, and it would import the fuel. Saudi Arabia, on the other hand, has expressed interest in enrichment itself. It's also negotiating with the Chinese and has also said that if Iran can enrich, they want to enrich too, even if for peaceful purposes. So, what a regional consortium idea could do in this context, where all these regional countries, these Persian Gulf states, do want, their own nuclear programs and nuclear energy civil programs and also in this context of the ties have actually been improving between Iran and Saudi Arabia and a lot of its
Mhm.
neighboring Persian Gulf states. So this would be something that they would create like a regional enrichment facility but this is again the sticking point that Iran has expressed openness to its idea, but it wants it to be on its territory. Other
Yeah.
proposals I've seen out there, it seems like the US proposal would not want it in Iran, it would want it in one of these, allied states. I've also seen proposals from like civil society and kind of non-proliferation experts talking about how it could be in Oman, which has closer relations with Iran, and Iran can have like a pilot enrichment facility on its own soil for like R&D purposes. But basically, what an enrichment consortium would do, it kind of multi creates this multilateral framework for nuclear enrichment
Yeah.
amongst these countries that have had adversarial relations at times. So it kind of addresses the security dilemma between them by each having transparency, being able to kind of provide transparency for everything that's going on. And so it could actually, and this would be something that I think very legitimately could be argued goes well beyond what Obama negotiated if they can
Yeah.
actually seal the deal on this and,
Well,
regionally address proliferation concerns as
well,
opposed to
yeah.
just Iran.
I mean, as you describe it, it seems that there is potentially a deal to be had. But as has always been the case with US Iran nuclear diplomacy, there are hardliners on both sides that certainly get a say in this. And it seems to me that, while there is a deal to be had, there's always that sort of obstacle in the way of overcoming the objections of the hardliners in Iran, in Washington, that don't want to see a relationship, that don't want to see a nuclear deal at all. They don't want to see closer ties between the countries.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, U.S.-Iran relations have been in this state of hostility since 1979, and there really are entrenched forces on both sides that have kind of really thrived on this confrontation. Uh, they view its continuation both in their kind of material interests, more so for Iran, but also many actors on the U.S. side, and also for ideological purposes on both sides, I would argue. Interestingly, the Republican Party, I mean, both Democratic and Republican administrations have been hawkish on Iran, trying to sanction it, pressure it, isolate it, contain it, whatnot. Republicans have been, more hawkish, I would say, at least, I mean, it could be argued, I mean, during the Bush administration and everything, especially his first term, obviously, and then Trump's first term. But so now it is interesting that we're having Trump, who has this pedigree of, imposing unprecedented pressure on Iran in his first term, this maximum pressure campaign, himself being very forward leaning on getting a
Yeah.
deal with Iran. And I think that has really created a lot of division amongst Republicans and within his administration. So we saw that, for example, Mike Waltz, his national security advisor, now removed. One of the reasons he was apparently removed was that he was very gung ho on greenlighting Israeli attacks on Iran. And Netanyahu's and Israel have historically been the biggest spoiler in U.S. Iran relations. And Netanyahu
Yeah.
has especially, yeah, been
Well, that's
pushing
actually why I
to
wanted
not
to
have
ask
these
you. That's
talks.
that's on
Yeah.
my list of questions to ask you, is that, there is this X factor out there, which is, what will Israel do? Or what will Netanyahu do? I mean, there's been plenty of reporting over the last few weeks that Netanyahu kind of keeps asking Trump for permission to bomb Iran's nuclear site, but Trump says, no, that wouldn't be appropriate because we're in negotiations. Um, like, I guess, how do you factor in that variable as, these negotiations proceed?
I think it's a very serious risk that, especially for Netanyahu, which, he's been under a lot of domestic pressure and international pressure, obviously, over the Gaza war. His coalition government is fragile. There's been many of his political opponents in Israel argue that Netanyahu has prolonged the Gaza war to basically keep his fragile coalition government in place, to not lose power and, you know, face charges over corruption charges and potentially go to prison. And from my understanding, those divisions in Israel are heating up. Currently, his coalition government, I was just reading today, again, it's in a very precarious state. They might lose some of their key parties in Netanyahu's coalition. So to me, I think that given Netanyahu's domestic precarious situation, his very clear desire to cling on to power at any cost, I would argue, coupled with his long, obsession with Iran and really portraying himself as like the Israeli leader who's going to like topple the Ayatollahs or hit them hard or whatnot, that this is a very dangerous moment. And he's been obviously pushing Trump very hard because, it is a debate, but I think this is a debate that's largely, there's consensus on the fact that, you know, can Israel attack Iran alone and inflict decisive damage on Iran's nuclear program without US support, or does it need US support? So the consensus really is, and there's even, US intelligence estimates that are public on this, that no, like for a decisive hit on Iran's nuclear capabilities that could really tangibly set it back, at least, by several months to a year, that they would need US support too. So, this is, I think, where Netanyahu has been really trying to press Trump to get a military attack on Iran. Trump, ran as kind of an anti-war candidate, has said he wants to end these wars, even started and then ended this kind of clash with the Houthis. So he's been hesitant. He's been opposed to this. And he's like, I'm trying to get a deal. Let's see if he does threaten Iran. And he always frames it in this kind of, we're trying to do it the nice way. If not, we might have to do it this way, to the extent that that's a bluff and that's just a pressure tactic. And if Trump, we'll see. But I do not discount the Israeli risk. I think that it'll go badly for everyone involved, including Israel. But I think Netanyahu himself is a very dangerous individual, and he can potentially try to create this situation where the outcome is uncertain even for him. But it might be more preferable than having his coalition government collapse, to deal with Iran and his political life over, and potentially facing prison in Israel and all of that.
Um, so, Sina, just to conclude, over the next several weeks or even months, what will you be looking towards that will suggest to you whether or not there is real meaningful progress on securing a potential deal between the United States and Iran on Iran's nuclear program?
Yeah, so I think these coming weeks are actually very important, especially just this weekend, because this weekend is the next scheduled round of talks between the US and Iran and Oman on Sunday. And this is going to be the first talk since the US sent a proposal to Iran 2 weeks ago, and Iran has reportedly given a counter offer. So we'll have to see that if whatever, the outcome of Sunday's meeting, if the rhetoric is positive, if they are moving closer to this kind of agreement on principles, like not the final deal, but like an initial deal where they kind of agree on a lot of their own bottom lines and end states. And I think, whether Iran can enrich or not is the key stumbling block there, but we'll see how that plays out. But beyond that, we have in October another deadline that's coming up, which is for the United. So under the Obama era deal, there was all these UN sanctions on Iran at the time that led to the 2015 deal. Unlike Trump's maximum pressure, which was unilateral, did not have international buy-in, Obama's sanctions were built up over 10 years, like 5 to 10 years, and they were enacted largely through UN Security Council resolution. So the 2015 deal was also enshrined in a new UN Security Council resolution 2231 that suspended all the previous 6 ones that were imposing sanctions on Iran. So the deadline that's coming up in October is a deadline that is based on this UN Security Resolution in 2015 that would, it says that 10 years after the JCPOA, the past UN Security Council resolutions will expire unless unless these parties to the deal try to snap them back as part of this snapback provision. So basically, we have the expiration of UN sanctions approaching in October, and the Europeans potentially, with American support, might move to as a Hail Mary to increase pressure on Iran, which is going to make things really harder to reverse diplomatically, reimpose all UN sanctions on Iran in
Mm,
October. And that's going to
mm.
create a whole new dilemma and really make this more complicated to resolve through diplomacy. But it also creates a deadline to try to get a deal before then as well.
Fascinating. All right. Well, I will be looking towards all of that. Thank you so much, Sina. This is really helpful.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
All right, and thank you everyone for joining this live stream. If you're not already a subscriber to both Sina's Substack and to Global Dispatches, please do so and become a paid subscriber as well to support more conversations like this. Thank you all, and we'll see you next time. Bye.